Monday, January the 27th in 1945, the day the Allies entered Auschwitz death camps, a place become the word since for evil and atrocity, synonymous with those two terms. More than 1 million people put to their death as part of the Nazis' mechanised attempt to wipe out the Jewish population in Europe, and others that the Nazis viewed in their ideology as inferior. Well, the number of survivors for this 80th anniversary now numbers around 50. Some return today for commemoration events alongside European leaders too. Now, the survivors, mostly in their 90s, braved freezing temperatures to attend today. Let's hear from some of them.
As I was being beaten mercilessly by a guard for fidgeting, for not being able to stand still for hours at an appel, a roll call, I looked into my mother's eyes. She was standing next to me, silently, and she was pleading with me, don't cry, hold on. And I didn't. I recall thinking, I will never let them know how much they are hurting me. At 5.5, I had the rebellion in me. I will not show them. I will not let them know the pain they're inflicting on me.
Widzimy w świecie współczesnym dzisiaj, teraz wielki wzrost antysemityzmu, a to przecież właśnie antysemityzm doprowadził do Holokaustu.
I want to cross to David Lees, an Associate Professor of French Studies at the University of Warwick and a cultural historian, and is researching the teaching and representations of the Holocaust. Great to have you on the programme this evening, David. First of all, can I ask your reflections on the commemoration today and incredibly powerful words we just heard from Marian Tuski, 98 years old?
Well, indeed, they are very moving and poignant images, aren't they, being beamed across the world from Auschwitz this evening and this afternoon. I think this is, as you've been mentioning already, Gavin, a deeply sombre occasion, and one which I think resonates for many of us who are in many ways committed to continuing to remember those awful atrocities now with the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, and thinking, of course, across Europe, including notably in France, where the Holocaust was enacted by people who were in power at the time, especially in France, where the Vichy government under Philippe Pétain and Pierre Laval, Prime Minister and head of state, were responsible for deporting some 76,000 Jews to the death camps, many of whom went to Auschwitz. Only around 2,000 came back. So across the Western world, across Western Europe, occupied Europe, this is a very sombre day indeed.
I want to quote to you, David, Leon Weintraub, a 99-year-old survivor from Lodz in Poland, who today described, quote, rising hatred, he said, on increasingly vocal movements, radical and anti-democratic right. What do you make of that?
Unfortunately, I think those comments are absolutely correct. We've seen across Europe, arguably across the entire globe, a rise in the far right and the popularity of the far right, notably in Western Europe, arguably some of those countries which are most impacted by the Holocaust, where the most significant numbers of people were deported. Hungary, Poland, for example, and of course Germany, France, Spain, where far right parties have been recently increasing in popularity and in power. Whether or not those parties try to distance themselves from their sort of historic past or the past of their predecessors, they nonetheless retain, I think, an element of anti-Semitic sort of content and insight.
I want to quote to you the FRA in the EU, a fundamental rights agency. Its director has said part of the wave of anti-Semitism has been driven by events in the Middle East, significantly increasing since October the 7th, the Hamas massacres, and then the war in Gaza. He said there's not enough separation of the actions and the policies of the Israeli government and ordinary communities.
Well, I think that's an absolutely fair comment, and we've seen, haven't we, as you say, since last year, a significant increase in anti-Semitism across the world. that has, of course, played into the hands of, as I say, those kind of far-right movements and parties for whom the Jewish community have always been traditionally scapegoats, going back to arguably the 19th century and beyond in Europe. So it's hardly surprising that agencies across the world are noting that. I think it's somewhat tragic, really, that we find ourselves in this position on this particular day, where, as those survivors have been so kind of powerfully saying, unfortunately, many of these far right movements, it is generally the far right, perhaps sometimes also the far left, who sort of single out Jewish people for this kind of ongoing sort of special treatment that's being perceived to be connected to, to sort of power, financial power, and so on. As I say, happened, for centuries really in Europe. So unfortunately, I think those comments are absolutely correct and stand true today.
And the difficulty here, the complexity of anti-Semitism, is also the overuse of anti-Semitism too readily in a modern situation. I'm going to quote to you that this is the chair of Israel's Holocaust Memorial Centre, Yad Vashem, who said the Israeli delegation to the UN, they wore yellow stars, a symbol of Nazi persecution of Jews, during a meeting of the UN Security Council after the Hamas massacre. Danny Dayan said the act dishonoured victims of the Holocaust. And we saw Benjamin Netanyahu in November as well, when he faced a warrant for international arrest at the ICC. He called those, facing alleged crimes against humanity, which he denied, but he said it was a, quote, anti-Semitic attack. So it's complex, isn't it, in terms of its use by politicians?
Well, indeed, it's a very complex term, and of course there are definitions of anti-Semitism that do sort of preclude criticism of Israel as a state. So it's a very complex, broad area. I mean, I think crucially what we're focusing on today, as we've been establishing, is the mass slaughter of innocent men, women, and children during those kind of awful atrocities committed in the name of the final solution by the Nazis. But anti-Semitism more broadly could include other kinds of exclusion and discrimination. But as you notably say, Gavin, it's important, I think, to make a distinction between this sort of suggestion of criticism of Israel, legitimate criticism of Israel as a state and its actions, and indeed these atrocities we're talking about today, which are kind of poles apart really in terms of anti-Semitism.
And the fundamental hate that preceded that, which we've heard from the survivors, it wasn't just about the event, it's what preceded it and the warning about what's going on now. David, a pleasure to talk to you. David Lees, Associate Professor at the University of Warwick.